Hello, everyone. Today we will be talking about invasive species and why they are bad news for our environment. This presentation is brought to you by the Invading Species Awareness Program. ISAP is a partnership between the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters and the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. ISAP was created to address the growing threat of invasive species here in Ontario. Our main goals are to teach people about invasive species, including how they got here and why they are such a threat here in our province. We also want to teach people how to limit future introductions of invasive species and limit their spread. And we're also involved in monitoring and early detection initiatives. We facilitate Ontario's Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System of Ontario, or EDMAPS for short. This database helps to map where invasive species are being found and help identify new introductions so that we can take action early on before they have a chance to establish here in Ontario, such as we've done with Asian carp and water soldier. Invasive species come from other parts of the world and are introduced by humans, either by accident or on purpose, likely without knowing the negative effects they would have here in Ontario. They come in many shapes and sizes and can be animals, plants, and even pathogens. For a species to be considered invasive, they have to have a negative impact on our environment or our way of life. Parrot feather is an aquatic plant that grows in dense mats that can clog waterways and displace native vegetation. Zebra mussels alter the water quality by filtering plankton out of the water. Large colonies can also affect swimmers and other recreational activities. Giant hogweed has phototoxic sap that can cause blisters if it comes into contact with the skin. Not every non-native or alien species is considered invasive. Most don't become permanently established, outcompete our native species, or cause negative impacts. Invasive species are here because of humans, and there are many ways that they arrive. Some species, like purple loosestrife, were introduced on purpose to be planted in gardens, not realizing how quickly they can spread and take over in nature. Other species, like zebra mussels, arrived in the ballast water of ships by accident. Asian carp escaped into the wild from fish farms because of flooding and have migrated towards Lake Michigan ever since. Humans can also spread invasive species once they have invaded. The round goby has been spread to many areas because of humans dumping their fishing bait in the water. There are special rules now to try and prevent this. For example, it is illegal to use round goby as bait or to transport live specimens. Many plants and small creatures like zebra mussels and spiny water fleas are spread by boats not being cleaned between locations. Sometimes people can't take care of pets anymore and think they are doing the right thing by releasing it into the wild. Unfortunately, this can be very bad for our ecosystems. What do you think people could do instead? Invasive species come in all shapes and sizes. They can be plants, fish, insects, or even pathogens and diseases. Do you recognize any of these species? So what makes a species so invasive? Invasive species have a competitive advantage over our native species. They take over ecosystems that they're introduced to, push out native species, and impact the overall biodiversity. They have very few natural predators because they're not a part of the natural food web. This allows them to grow and spread very quickly. They also reproduce quickly. For example, the round goby can spawn several times a year, whereas our native fish typically only reproduce once. Invasive plants also tend to produce more seeds than our native plants. They are highly adaptable and they thrive in disturbed habitats. These advantages allow invasive species to outcompete native species for resources like food and habitat. Invasive species have social impacts, which means they disrupt people's way of life or health. They reduce the number of resources available, like food and water. They also make the environment less suitable for humans. For example, hydrilla can clog and damage dams and can reduce the flow of rivers by up to 85%. Some pose health risks and spread diseases. Giant hogweed has a toxic sap that can cause blisters on the skin. With invasive species pushing out native species and reducing biodiversity, people won't want to spend as much time out in nature. Invasive species can also have economic impacts. In Canada, invasive species costs around $30 billion a year, both through direct and indirect costs. It costs a lot of money for landowners, municipalities, and provincial and federal governments to control invasive species once they've established. It is less expensive to invest in prevention. Invasive species that damage the agricultural and forestry industries result in an estimated $7.5 billion loss of revenue every year in Canada. Invasive species also have an impact on approximately 20% of the species at risk here in Ontario. Invasive species can also impact ecosystems by reducing biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of living things in an environment. A habitat with lots of different types of trees, mammals, insects, plants, fish has a high biodiversity. An environment with only a few different species has low biodiversity. When invasive species are introduced, they can push out native species that are supposed to be here. Less species means lower biodiversity. Invasive species make it hard for our native species to survive. Native species are the plants, fish, and animals that are from Canada and Ontario and have been here for a very long time. Invasive species are aggressive, spread and reproduce quickly, and are typically bigger than our native species. These bullies take away things that our native species need to survive, like food and water, and destroy the places that they live. Invasive species like Asian carps remove and alter parts of the habitat, which affects all of the other species in the environment. Asian carps refer to 4 different species: bighead carp, silver carp, grass carp, and black carp. Bighead carp and silver carp are the biggest threats to Ontario waters. Bighead carp and silver carp both have eyes that sit below the mouth. Silver carp are also called flying carp because they can jump 3 or more meters out of the water when they are frightened by boat engines. This can be very dangerous for boaters. Grass carp can be easily confused with a variety of our native minnow species, as well as common carp. Black carp closely resembles the grass carp and can get up to 80 pounds. Both of these species have eyes that sit even with the mouth. Asian carps were introduced to North America from Asia in the 1960s and 70s and have since spread through waterways in the United States, moving north towards the Great Lakes. Flooding near the Mississippi River allowed these carps to escape into the wild. The bighead and silver carp are on the doorstep of the Great Lakes. In 2009, they were discovered 150 kilometers from Lake Michigan. Grass carp have been discovered in the Great Lakes area, but always in small numbers and mostly sterile, meaning that they can't reproduce. We are very lucky that they have not established in the Great Lakes, and preventing them from doing so is the best way to protect our native fish and ecosystems. Asian carps take away food from our native species. They are big fish. Grass carp can be over 80 pounds and eat up to 40% of their body weight in plants every day. This takes away food and habitat from our native species. They're also big eaters. Bighead and silver carp don't have a true stomach, so they have to eat almost constantly. Since they are continuously eating zooplankton, detritus, and small bugs, they are leaving little food for our native species, particularly young fish that rely on zooplankton and invertebrates as a food source. Asian carps reproduce and spread very quickly, taking up lots of space and leaving little room for other species. Silver carp are like bullies to humans too. Boat vibrations can cause them to jump out of the water, which can affect recreation and cause injury. Let's take a closer look at this in a video.
This is what happens when a particular population of fish in the Illinois River is startled.
Yeah, oh, right around back, behind the boat. Wow. Watch out. They're everywhere.
These are silver carp, the most notorious of the Asian carp family. Many believe the Illinois River has the densest population of silver carp in the nation.
That's kind of ground zero on this invasion.
Asian carp were introduced to the United States in the 1970s to control algae in catfish farms in the South. In the 1980s, floodwaters allowed the carp to escape, and infest the Mississippi River basin.
When it comes to the river systems, if it's connected, if it's got a direct connection to the Mississippi or the Illinois River, it's going to have these fish in it.
Asian carp not only disrupt the food chain, push out native fish, are a nuisance to boaters, but they are also extremely dangerous.
Yeah, this is about an average size silver carp. This is the one that can hurt you when it jumps. Your boat's going 20, 30 miles an hour and this guy hits you, it's going to leave a mark.
Now there is concern that Asian carp have a path out of the rivers and into the Great Lakes through the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. So a multi-million-dollar electronic barrier has been constructed to potentially stop the migration.
With the barriers in place, we are effectively plugging the biggest hole for the movement of these fish. It would be very difficult for fish to just swim right through this waterway behind us.
But not everyone is convinced, so cleaning, training, and drying boats every time they come out of the water can prevent the tiny microscopic creatures who lurk there from ending up in lakes and rivers where they shouldn't call home. It's the best defense we have against the ever-growing world of the silent invaders.
Asian carps aren't the only invasive species that affect ecosystems. Zebra mussels can change the water quality in areas where they are introduced. They are originally from Eurasia and were introduced in the 1980s. It is believed that they were brought over in the ballast water of large ships. They filter water by removing food sources like plankton. In aquatic food webs, plankton is the base of the food chain. Many species, including baby fish, rely on plankton for food. With plankton removed, entire food webs can be altered. Clearer water allows sunlight to reach deeper, which increases the growth of aquatic plants. It can also increase toxic algal blooms. Zebra mussels grow in large colonies, and one zebra mussel can filter 1 liter of water per day. Imagine how much plankton is being removed from the water when a large colony is established. They can also affect you as the swimmer because their sharp shells could easily cut your feet. Invasive Phragmites takes away habitat from native species. Take a look at this picture. Does this look like a healthy habitat? Can you see lots of different types of plants? Do you think lots of animals could live here? Phragmites grows very tall. Other plants below can't reach the sunlight. They also grow in large clumps, which leaves no space for native species, and it limits the air that reaches small plants. They also have very deep roots, which drain water from the soil and take up lots of soil that native plants need to survive. Unfortunately, where Phragmites is present, there are very few other species. On top of being big bullies, invasive species disturb food webs. Food webs contain many different food chains that consist of producers and consumers. Predators are animals that eat another animal, and prey are the animals that get eaten. Food webs are complex systems, and every species in the ecosystem plays an important role. When invasive species are introduced, they can change food webs by taking away food from native species. If there's not enough food for those species, they may be forced to find a new habitat or may disappear altogether. When an invasive species is introduced, they affect the natural balance of food webs. Since Asian carps primarily feed on plankton and lots of it, they take away food from other species like benthos, omnivores, and planktivores. If these species don't have enough food, what do you think could happen? They could be forced to find new habitats or could end up disappearing altogether. With the benthos, omnivore, and planktivore species removed, the species higher up the food chain, such as the benthos and fish-eating fish, are also left without food. Without food and habitat, these species can also disappear. While fish-eating fish like smallmouth bass may feed on young Asian carp, these species can grow extremely fast, up to 30 centimeters in their first year, which means they are not a consistent food source for them. Does this still look like a healthy food web? Invasive species of all kinds can disturb habitats and food webs, both in the water and on land. Invasive species are bad news for our environment, but there are lots of things that you can do to help. First, learn to identify invasive species so you don't spread them by accident. If you know what to look for, it is much easier to prevent the spread. We have lots of information and fact sheets on our website to help you learn. Don't dump invasive species into nature. Keep nature wild. Find other options for disposing of invasive species and relocating unwanted pets. Check your shoes and boats for invasive species before moving to another area. Make it a habit to clean off your boats and fishing equipment, or to clean off your shoes between walks. Don't move firewood that could be contaminated with forest pests. If you heat your home with firewood, or like to go camping, get firewood as close to home or to the campground as you can so you don't move unwanted bugs. Report your sightings to our phone number or website. Reporting invasive species helps us to know where they are being found, how fast they are spreading, and it helps to identify new introductions for early actions. Make sure you take some pictures to send with your report. Thank you for listening. With your help, we can stop invasive species from pushing out our native species. Be sure to check out these activities on our website to test your knowledge and learn more about invasive species in Ontario.